You've heard of Persia, the empire of silk, gold, and gods. But behind its shimmering palaces lay something darker, a world where justice was carved into flesh, where loyalty was proven through pain, and where kings ruled not by mercy, but by terror. In the royal courts of Persia, death was never quick. It was a lesson. Tonight, you'll walk through the empire's hidden chambers where beauty and brutality shared the same throne, and where the greatest civilization of its time built its glory on human suffering. In the heart of Persepolis, sunlight poured over columns that stretched toward heaven, each stone carved with gods, warriors, and kings. From a distance, it seemed like a kingdom of divine perfection, a place where law and order flowed from the throne of gold itself. Yet beneath the polished marble floors, something vile pulsed through the empire's veins. The deeper one went below the royal chambers. The further one fell from light into the empire's hidden conscience, its underworld of punishment. It was here that the Achaemenid kings maintained their truest form of control. They called it justice, but it was fear, shaped, polished, and ritualized. Every act of cruelty was recorded not only in memory, but in flesh. The Persians believed that a crime against the king was a crime against the divine. And when the divine was offended, there could be no forgiveness, only spectacle. In secret halls beneath the throne, soldiers led condemned men chained in silence. The scent of incense mixed with something far heavier, iron, sweat, and rot. Punishments varied, but all shared a single purpose: to transform human agony into warning. Some were flayed alive, their skins hung like banners beside the pillars. Others were impaled upon stakes so tall their bodies twisted in the wind. To the spectators above, the city shone with beauty. To those below, it was built on torment. Xerxes' I, remembered for his vast conquests, was also remembered for his absolute paranoia. Historians wrote that his mercy was rarer than snow in the Persian desert. Servants vanished without record. Advisors who failed in their duties were stripped, whipped, and nailed to the very walls they once guarded. To displease the king was to invite a punishment meant not just to destroy the body, but to erase the soul, to silence existence itself. Yet cruelty here was not chaos. It was art. The punishments followed ritual, timing, procession, offering. To the Persians, pain was purification, the body a vessel for divine balance. If the empire was to remain perfect, corruption had to be torn out by the roots. In that belief, they sanctified suffering. Above, priests and nobles celebrated in gold-draped halls, drinking wine as torches flickered over carved reliefs of perfect order, soldiers in harmony, captives in submission. But each carved image carried a hidden truth. These were not mere decorations. They were declarations of fear. Every prisoner etched in stone, every bowed head, represented the living reality beneath the palace, a reminder that beneath all grandeur lies domination. The throne itself, they said, stood directly above the chambers of punishment. And when the king sat upon it, he could feel the faint tremor of screams beneath his feet, the heartbeat of obedience. When Persepolis burned centuries later, archaeologists found traces of those forgotten dungeons, charred chains fused to the stone, skeletal remains bound in positions of torment. The empire that once called itself eternal was buried alongside its victims. And so, beneath the throne of gold, Persia's power revealed its truest form, not the strength of armies, but the mastery of fear. Because in the Persian Royal Court, justice was not a matter of law. It was the art of cruelty, painted in silence, sealed beneath the throne forever. In the reign of Darius I, justice was sacred, a divine extension of the king himself. The empire's strength rested not only on armies and gold, but on obedience. To betray the law was to betray the gods. And in this world, punishment was not meant merely to end a life. It was meant to engrave a lesson, to make one man's suffering speak for centuries. The story of Judge Sisms is perhaps the most haunting example of Persian justice, turned to ritualized horror. Sisms was a royal judge, a man entrusted with the sacred task of delivering truth. But temptation overcame him. He accepted a bribe, twisting verdicts for silver. When word reached Darius, the king saw not corruption alone. He saw decay within the empire's moral flesh. And decay, in the Persian world, was to be cut away, piece by piece. Sisms was brought before the throne, trembling beneath the gaze of a king who claimed his rule by divine right. Darius spoke of truth, of honor, of the sacred duty between ruler and judge, and then, with a gesture, condemned him to the fate reserved for the faithless. What followed would stain the very walls of justice itself. The executioners began their work not with sword or flame, but with knives, thin and deliberate. Sisms was flayed alive, his screams rising through the stone corridors until they sounded like chants. His skin, carefully peeled and preserved, was to serve a higher purpose. Darius ordered it stretched and nailed to the judge's own chair, the seat from which he had once delivered deceitful judgments. The flesh hardened with time, darkened by oil and blood, until it became more than a relic. It became a warning. When the execution was complete, the king summoned Sisms' son, Otanes. With a cold, unwavering calm, Darius appointed the young man to take his father's place. He was to sit upon the same chair, wrapped in the flesh of betrayal, and remember, every moment of his life, what justice demanded. To falter was to follow his father into agony. To modern ears, this punishment sounds monstrous. Yet in ancient Persia, it was order restored. The act was not seen as sadism but purification, the cleansing of corruption through sacrifice. Darius ruled a vast and diverse empire, stretching from Egypt to the Indus. For him, fear was not cruelty. It was control. The empire's survival depended on it. Greek historians later wrote of this punishment with equal awe and revulsion. Herodotus described it as the embodiment of Persian law, absolute, unflinching, divine. It revealed how deeply the Persians believed that truth was flesh, and once it rotted, it had to be displayed to preserve the body politic. Over centuries, the legend of Sisms lived on, not just in chronicles but in whispers among judges across empires. To sit in judgment was to feel the ghost of that skin beneath them, a memory of agony that demanded virtue. When archaeologists uncovered reliefs from the palaces of Susa, they found inscriptions praising Darius for cutting away the rotten from the pure. The words were poetic, but the reality was not. Justice in Persia was measured not by mercy, but by endurance. And so, from the flayed skin of a single man, Darius built the illusion of incorruptibility, a justice system that ruled through terror, its foundation stretched tight, like leather beneath the weight of power. Because in the Persian Royal Court, truth was not spoken. It was carved. In the heart of Persepolis stood chambers the world was never meant to see, the royal harems of the Persian kings. Draped in silk, perfumed in incense, they were not places of pleasure as outsiders imagined, but prisons of devotion. Behind jeweled screens lived hundreds of women, wives, concubines, and slaves, each bound to the will of one man whose moods shaped their fates. To speak out was treason. To whisper was death. And within those walls, silence became survival. The Persian court believed the harem symbolized order, beauty contained, temptation controlled, lineage preserved. But beneath its glittering surface lay a quieter horror. The women who entered its gates rarely left. They were watched by eunuchs, men castrated to ensure obedience and purity, their own mutilation making them both servants and jailers. No sound escaped those walls, except laughter forced by fear. Under Xerxes' eye, the harem's power grew, not by design, but through paranoia. The king's anger was unpredictable, sharpened by rumor and betrayal. When whispers spread of a concubine's affair with a palace guard, the punishment was swift and unspeakable. The guard vanished. The woman was said to have been buried alive beneath the mosaic floors, sealed within the beauty she had once adorned. Whether this tale is truth or legend, it echoes the cruelty that shaped the empire's private chambers, where the king's wrath became a god's decree. Poison was the harem's most silent weapon. Court records from later dynasties tell of women executed not by blade, but by cup. A servant's trembling hand offered wine laced with venom, and a smile disguised execution. Even the queen mother, Parasitis, was infamous for such refined vengeance, selecting her victims, mixing their fates into food, and watching quietly as they died before her. The harem was not merely a place of pleasure. It was a theater of slow, calculated death. Each disappearance was explained away as illness or divine punishment. To the outside world, the women of the harem were untouchable, living embodiments of beauty and devotion. Inside, they lived in a hierarchy of dread. The youngest girls prayed to remain invisible. The elder wives prayed for sleep. And those who failed to please the king, those who aged, who questioned, who desired freedom, were erased from existence, their names scratched from records, their faces from memory. The servants knew. They carried trays and saw the emptied chambers. They heard muffled cries behind stone doors that were never reopened. But in Persia, knowledge could kill as swiftly as guilt. So they swallowed their truths, and the palace feasted on silence. Centuries later, archaeologists found fragments of golden pins, perfume bottles, and jewelry buried in the dust beneath Persepolis. They were not buried with honor, they were buried to hide. For every crown, there was a corpse unseen. For every celebration, a silenced voice. The Persians built monuments to their kings, towering columns, immortal inscriptions. Yet the true legacy of their empire lay within those sealed rooms, where beauty became bondage and obedience demanded death. The harem was a microcosm of the empire itself, radiant in appearance, hollowed by terror. And though time has reduced its splendor to ruins, the silence remains. Because in the Persian Royal Court, even whispers were crimes. And every feast began with a prayer that tonight the silence would not take you. Among all the cruelties devised by the Persian Empire, one punishment eclipsed the rest in both horror and precision: scaphism. It was not designed to kill swiftly, but to unmake a person, inch by inch, in the eyes of the gods in the empire. In this method of execution, death was not the act itself, it was the destination of a slow, orchestrated decay. The story of scaphism survives through the Greek historian Plutarch, who wrote of its use under King Artaxerxes II. A Persian soldier named Mithridates had committed the ultimate crime. He boasted of slaying the king's enemy when the glory belonged to another. For his arrogance, Artaxerxes decreed that he should die in a manner so dreadful that his name would serve as a warning to all who defied the crown. 2 hollowed wooden boats were brought forth. Mithridates was laid between them, his body trapped from neck to toe, leaving only his head, hands, and feet exposed. The scenes were sealed tight, imprisoning him in darkness. Then began the ritual, 1 part punishment, 1 part offering. The executioners fed him milk and honey until he could drink no more. His mouth overflowed. His body convulsed. Then, they smeared the same mixture across his face and limbs, coating him in sweetness, a lure for what would come next. The boats were dragged to a stagnant marsh where the sun burned without mercy. Tied there, half immersed in the water, Mithridates became a feast. Flies, wasps, and beetles swarmed his body. They entered his mouth, his nostrils, his open sores. Each hour brought fresh agony as insects burrowed deeper. His skin blistered. His flesh began to rot while he still breathed. It was said he survived for days, delirious, screaming prayers that even the gods refused to hear. The Persians did not invent this cruelty. They perfected it. To them, the punishment mirrored divine justice. A man who corrupted truth would be consumed by corruption itself, eaten alive by the smallest of creatures. It was philosophy rendered in horror. To the court, this was not madness but balance restored. Witnesses were ordered to attend. They stood in silence as Mithridates withered, his body bloating and splitting beneath the sun. On the seventh day, only faint movement remained, the eyes still pleading, the breath still shallow. When at last the insects had devoured his insides, the boats were opened. What was left was not a man, but a husk crawling with the life that had killed him. Scaphism became legend. It was whispered among soldiers and scribes as proof that no deceit escaped the king's sight. And though few dared to use it again, its shadow lingered, a symbol of how far divine kingship could descend into sanctified cruelty. Centuries later, historians would argue whether the tale was exaggerated by Persian enemies. But the question misses the point. Whether myth or memory, it speaks to a truth about power, that when men believe themselves divine, they no longer punish to protect order. They punish to witness suffering. In the Persian Royal Court, death was a message, and scaphism was its loudest voice, a hymn of decay sung beneath the unblinking sun, where mercy drowned in honey and one man's agony became the empire's eternal silence. In the shadowed corridors of the Persian palaces, power did not always wear a crown. It whispered through soft voices, hidden behind veils and gilded curtains, the voices of the eunuchs. They were the empire's silent guardians, its watchers and keepers of secrets. Yet their power was born from mutilation, their loyalty carved into their bodies long before their minds could understand its meaning. The making of a eunuch began in childhood. Across the empire, from conquered lands and distant villages, boys were chosen for their beauty, their intelligence, or their lineage. They were taken from their homes, stripped of family, language, and self. In dark rooms, priests and surgeons performed the act that would define their lives: castration. Some died in agony from infection or blood loss. Others survived only to awaken to a silence deeper than pain, a future of obedience. To the Persian court, the eunuch was a paradox, both trusted and despised, revered and feared. Deprived of heirs, he was considered pure, incapable of personal ambition. Yet this same purity made him dangerous. A eunuch owed loyalty only to the throne. He could be confidant, assassin, or spy. In the vast harem, where no man could enter, eunuchs were the king's eyes. Their mutilation became the key to the empire's most private world. Records from the Achaemenid and later Parthian courts describe eunuchs who rose to extraordinary influence. They guarded royal chambers, delivered decrees, even advised kings on matters of war and diplomacy. But their status was fragile, purchased through pain and sustained by fear. A eunuch who faltered in his duty faced punishments harsher than death. Some were blinded, others flayed, their bodies displayed as examples to the next generation of the obedient. The Chamber of the Eunuchs in Persepolis was not an official title, but a whispered truth. It was the inner circle, a place of both privilege and despair. There, dozens lived together in service, sleeping beneath the sound of the royal court above. Their laughter was forced, their loyalty absolute. They belonged to no one and everyone at once. And though they were trusted with the empire's deepest secrets, they had no names beyond what their masters gave them. Ancient texts suggest that many sought solace in religion. Some believed their suffering was a sacrifice, that by giving up their manhood, they purified the sins of those they served. But others, broken by years of servitude, turned to quiet rebellion. They poisoned rivals, spread false rumors, and whispered vengeance in the language of silence. In the end, their mutilation had not erased desire. It had only transformed it, from lust for flesh to hunger for control. When the great palaces fell, the eunuchs were among the first to be forgotten. Their graves were unmarked, their stories erased. Yet in fragments of Persian inscriptions, Their presence lingers, nameless servants praised for their faith beyond the flesh. History remembers the kings of Persia as gods among men. But behind every divine decree stood a mutilated servant who ensured its survival. Their pain was the machinery of power, their silence its fuel. In the Persian Royal Court, every cruelty had purpose. And in the chamber of the eunuchs, that purpose was eternal, to prove that obedience could be engineered, that humanity could be reshaped by the knife, and that loyalty in the end was best born from pain. In the glittering halls of the Persian Royal Court, loyalty and death were often served on the same plate. Feasts were meant to display the empire's splendor. Towers of meat, rivers of wine, gold that reflected the firelight. Yet beneath the perfume and laughter, the banquet table was the most dangerous place in the kingdom. Here, ambition was tested through the art of poison. And no one mastered that art like the Persians. The reign of Artaxerxes III marked the height of these silent executions. The court was a maze of intrigue, where noblemen smiled as they plotted one another's ruin. The king's mother, Parysatis, was said to be the deadliest presence in those rooms. She understood that blades could be traced, but poison left no witnesses. Her reputation became legend, a woman who could smile through a killing and toast the corpse before it hit the floor. One tale tells of a servant she despised for betraying her favorite son. During a royal feast, she prepared a dish of roasted bird, half seasoned for the guests, half laced with toxin. The servant ate from the wrong side of the platter. He fell, gasping, before the music had stopped. The queen continued to eat calmly as chaos erupted around her. When asked later how she could watch such horror, she replied, "It is not horror. It is order." For Parysatis and those who followed her, poison was not merely a tool, it was ceremony. The Persians believed that the gods gave every substance a purpose. If herbs could heal, they could also purify. A traitor's death by poison was seen as cleansing, his body returning to the elements without bloodshed. It was cruelty refined into elegance. Yet no one at court could ever truly relax. Each goblet of wine might hold both blessing and death. Nobles trained their eyes to watch the king's cup. Servants prayed their trembling hands would not betray them. Some hired tasters, slaves chosen for their expendability, who drank first and waited in terror to see if their bodies would fail. Many did. The rituals of poison became as intricate as religion. Certain powders were dissolved in honey, others mixed with milk to mask bitterness. The ingredients were traded like secrets: nightshade, arsenic, hemlock, each possessing its own slow rhythm of death. Some victims died swiftly, others over days, their bodies wasting as the court whispered prayers for their illness. The true genius of Persian poison was psychological. No one could know if death was coming, not even the innocent. Suspicion hollowed the palace. Trust eroded like metal in acid. Kings watched their own children with guarded eyes. Queens tested their wine in silence, and every feast felt like an execution rehearsed in gold. When Artaxerxes III himself was finally poisoned by his own general, Bagoas, who poured venom into the king's cup, the empire understood its irony. The master of fear had been slain by his own methods. Centuries later, historians called it political murder. But in Persia, it was simply balance restored, a circle of poison closing upon itself. In the Persian royal court, death did not shout. It smiled. And every banquet was a prayer that your next breath would not be your last. Behind the jeweled veils of the Persian palace, love was a dangerous illusion. A concubine's smile could lift her from servitude to power, or condemn her to torment beyond death. In the empire's endless struggle between loyalty, jealousy, and revenge, the most horrifying punishments were not delivered by kings, but by the women who ruled beside them. None embodied this more than Queen Amestris, wife of Xerxes I, a woman whose vengeance carved terror into the heart of the royal court. Amestris was not remembered for beauty, but for will. She was the daughter of a military noble, married to Xerxes while still young. Within the walls of Persepolis, she watched her husband's passion drift toward other women, particularly one nobleman's wife whose beauty was whispered about in the corridors. The king's affair was scandalous, but a mistress's response would become legend. During the royal feast of Sakia, a festival when the Persians celebrated renewal and rebirth, the queen offered the king a robe she had woven herself. It was a gesture of devotion, or so it seemed. But when the celebration ended, she summoned guards and gave a quiet, cold command. The rival woman was taken in the night, stripped of her garments, and brought before a mistress. What followed was not execution, but mutilation designed to erase her humanity. According to Herodotus, a mistress ordered the woman's breasts, nose, ears, lips, and tongue to be cut off, each piece fed to dogs before her eyes. The victim was left alive, broken, a living warning to those who dared attract the king's gaze. The horror did not end there. A mistress demanded that the woman's family be impaled, their bodies displayed beyond the city walls. It was a massacre justified as honor, vengeance performed as ritual. In the Persian court, such cruelty was rarely questioned. A queen's wrath was an extension of divine order, and no man could challenge it. But behind the facade of ceremony, fear spread like poison. Servants avoided the queen's path. Concubines wept silently in their chambers. Even Xerxes, history suggests, grew wary of the woman he once ruled beside. A mistress's cruelty reflected something deeper within Persian royalty, a sickness born of isolation and absolute power. The harem was a golden prison, where affection became currency and suspicion festered in silence. Each woman fought not only for love, but for survival, their bodies the battlegrounds of imperial politics. A mistress understood this truth and turned it into a weapon. Her vengeance was not madness alone. It was the logic of a world where pain was the only language of permanence. Centuries later, historians debated whether Herodotus exaggerated the story. Yet even if myth has colored it, the message remains unchanged. In the Persian court, cruelty was inherited as tradition. The blood of kings and queens flowed together, thickened by fear and pride. A mistress lived long after Xerxes' death, her name whispered with awe and disgust. Some said she died peacefully. Others believed her spirit cursed the palace she once ruled. But her shadow never faded. In the Persian Royal Court, beauty was power, and power was punishment. A mistress's cruelty revealed an empire's heart, not ruled by love, but by the terror of losing it. Long before the splendor of Persepolis fell to ashes, there was a night when the priests of Persia, the Magi, were hunted like vermin. Their sacred chants once echoed through fire temples, calling upon Ahura Mazda for purity and truth. Yet when the empire's throne was seized in treachery, those same voices were silenced beneath earth and stone. The massacre of the Magi was not a myth. It was a purge that soaked the land in holy blood. The story began after the death of Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great. In his absence, a man named Gaumata, a priest of the Magi caste, seized power by impersonating Cambyses' dead brother, Bardia. The deception was cunning and divine in its execution. Gaumata ruled for months, declaring tax remissions and freeing conscripts to win the people's favor. But in the royal circles, whispers grew. The man on the throne was an impostor, a magus in disguise. When Darius, a nobleman of the Achaemenid line, uncovered the truth, he led 6 conspirators into the palace. What followed was a bloodbath hidden behind golden doors. Gaumata was dragged from his chambers and slaughtered, his body left mutilated in the torchlight. But Darius's vengeance did not end with the false king. He unleashed his fury upon the entire priestly class, accusing them of poisoning the empire with deceit. On the day of the purge, the streets of Ecbatana ran red. Darius ordered his soldiers to hunt every magus they could find, priests, scholars, even acolytes barely old enough to speak. Homes were raided, temple set ablaze, and the sacred fire, once eternal, was smothered beneath boot and ash. The massacre lasted for a full day and night. When it ended, thousands of bodies lay heaped in pits outside the city. To commemorate the slaughter, Darius declared a new festival, the Magophonia, the killing of the Magi. Every year, Persians would mark that day by forbidding priests from appearing in public, mocking their memory with feasts and laughter. The event was not only vengeance but propaganda, a warning written in blood that no one, not even the keepers of the sacred flame, stood above the king's authority. Yet beneath the silence of victory, something darker lingered. The empire had murdered its own spiritual spine. The Magi were not mere priests. They were the interpreters of law, the keepers of ritual purity, the guardians of cosmic balance. Their destruction fractured the spiritual unity of Persia, leaving a wound that never healed. Centuries later, Zoroastrian chronicles spoke of divine punishment that followed. Droughts plagued the land, temples decayed, and the royal line itself withered in betrayal and madness. The gods, it was said, had turned away from their children. Archaeologists have uncovered burial sites near ancient Ecbatana, vast pits filled with bones burned and broken. Some still bear the marks of ritual garments, confirming that the victims were indeed priests. The Pit of the Magi, as modern historians call it, is a silent echo of Darius's cruelty, an empire's fear of its own truth. In killing the Magi, Darius silenced the voices that once bound the empire's soul. His reign would bring order, wealth, and conquest, but the whispers of that pit followed him to his grave. The fires of the Magi were meant to burn forever. That night, Persia smothered its own flame. Beneath the royal palaces of Susa, where columns of glazed brick still shimmer faintly in desert light, there lies a network of tombs that once entombed the kings and courtiers of Persia. Their stones were carved with prayers for eternity, but the silence they hold is not peace. It is guilt. For centuries, Susa was more than an imperial capital. It was a city built upon buried secrets, where the dead were not allowed to rest. According to ancient records, the tombs were guarded by eunuchs sworn to eternal service. They were forbidden to speak of what they saw, yet they became the unwilling witnesses to rituals that turned burial into desecration. When noblemen or traitorous officials fell from favor, their bodies were not burned in honor but sealed alive within the royal necropolis, entombed as warnings, their names erased from memory. Darius and his successors turned burial into a language of power. The higher one's loyalty, the higher the tomb was carved into the cliff. Betrayal earned a darker fate, a hollow chamber, unmarked, deep below the royal vaults. Archaeologists later found remains bound with bronze wire, skulls fractured, teeth missing, the evidence of slow, deliberate death. Legends speak of the Whispering Tombs, a cursed section beneath the palace where condemned officials were sealed alive beside the bodies of those they once betrayed. The priests would chant over the chambers, invoking silence, yet at night, the guards swore they heard voices, gasping, muttering, whispering confessions that clawed through the stone. Centuries later, even Alexander the Great's soldiers refused to camp near those ruins. The Macedonians who entered the necropolis reported the air heavy with decay, as though the dead themselves still clung to the walls. The tombs became a symbol of the Persian obsession with control, where even in death, hierarchy and fear remained absolute. Modern excavations reveal a more terrifying truth. Some tombs were built with narrow shafts leading upward, allowing air to pass enough to keep the dying alive for days. It was punishment disguised as burial. The condemned would die listening to the echoes of chanting priests above them, their souls deliberately trapped between life and death. The Persians believed silence was sacred, but in Susa, silence became a curse. Each tomb held a secret, each whisper a sin carved in stone. The royal court built its eternity on the bones of those it silenced. The tombs of Susa still whisper, not with ghosts, but with history, the voices of the forgotten, buried alive in the empire's hunger for obedience. The empire that sought immortality created only echoes, and the dead of Susa never stopped speaking. As the centuries unfolded, the Persian Empire's greatest curse was not rebellion from without, but betrayal from within. The royal blood that once unified the empire turned against itself, each generation devouring the next in a cycle of paranoia, deceit, and ritualized murder. The Achaemenid line had been born of divine kingship, but it died in incest, treachery, and madness. The seeds were sown with Xerxes' sons. After his assassination, his heirs fought over the throne like vultures over a carcass. Artaxerxes I murdered his brother Darius, who had plotted rebellion. Later, his own son Xerxes II was killed by another half-brother. Sogdianus, who was in turn executed by Ochus, soon crowned Darius II. Each murder was justified by divine right. Each betrayal sanctified by royal priests who anointed the killer's hands in perfumed oil while blood still stained them. In the harem, where royal mothers and concubines plotted their children's survival, poison became the language of inheritance. Wine mixed with mercury, bread dusted with crushed emeralds, assassins disguised as servants. The royal family learned to eat in silence, to sleep beside daggers. The betrayal of bloodlines reached its fevered height with Queen Parasatis, wife of Darius II, known to her subjects as the Serpent Queen. She ruled through manipulation and terror. When her son Cyrus the Younger rebelled against his brother Artaxerxes II, she secretly supported him, only to watch Cyrus die in battle. In vengeance, she flayed alive the man who had delivered the killing blow and forced his executioners to eat his flesh. Yet Parasitus's cruelty did not end there. Fearing retribution, she poisoned Artaxerxes' favored wife, Statira, by dipping one side of a knife in venom before dividing a bird between them. The queen ate safely. The young consort died writhing in agony. The act was celebrated in whispers, feared in silence. A mother's love turned into divine wrath. The Persian royal house had become a theater of ritual cruelty. Every death was masked by ceremony. Every murder justified by divine favor. Blood was no longer sacred, it was political currency. When Alexander the Great conquered Persia, he found not an empire of warriors, but one suffocating under the weight of its own decadence. The once mighty Achaemenids had devoured themselves, leaving behind only the glittering corpse of a dynasty. The betrayal of bloodlines was not simply murder, it was the slow suicide of an empire that mistook blood for destiny. By the end, there was no royal line left untouched by poison or blade. Persia's kings had won the world and lost their souls to their own blood. By the twilight of the Achaemenid Empire, Persia's grandeur had curdled into decay. What had once been an empire of architects and scholars had become a gilded cage ruled by fear and indulgence. The moral fabric that bound court and people alike, the dignity once tied to truth and honor, was stripped bare beneath the silken robes of kings who had forgotten what power meant. Artaxerxes III, who came to power through massacre, embodied that decay. When he seized the throne, he murdered 80 of his own half-brothers to eliminate rivals. Not even infants were spared. The royal palace became a charnel house disguised as a court, and his reign a monument to cruelty hidden beneath gold and incense. The Persian nobility, once the empire's backbone, became prisoners of their own cowardice. Men who had once fought beside Cyrus and Darius now groveled before eunuchs and poisoners. To question the king was treason. To serve him faithfully was death delayed. Dignity, once a measure of one's soul, became a luxury no one could afford. Even in victory, humiliation replaced honor. Captured rebels were stripped naked, paraded through the streets, and whipped until their skin hung in ribbons. Those accused of treason were subjected to the boats, one of Persia's most infamous punishments. The condemned was trapped between two hollowed-out logs, fed milk and honey until insects devoured his flesh alive over days of slow decay. The torture was not performed in darkness but under sunlight, before courtiers who watched in silence, their faces expressionless masks of obedience. The death of dignity was not in the violence itself, it was in the silence that followed. Servants wiped the blood from marble floors. Musicians played softly to drown the screams. The court scribes recorded victories and festivals, never executions. Even history was made to kneel. In the temples, priests chanted prayers that no longer reached the heavens. The sacred fire still burned, but its light no longer reflected truth, only fear. The empire had lost the courage to look at itself. When Artaxerxes III was finally poisoned by his own minister, the court barely stirred. There was no mourning, no grief, only quiet relief. His death was not justice, but exhaustion. It was the empire's final surrender to decay. Persia's greatness did not collapse in a single battle. It died slowly, suffocated by its own rituals, its cruelty, and its loss of soul. The people no longer believed in their kings, and the kings no longer believed in anything. The empire's vast palaces stood silent, their stones heavy with memories of pride and shame. The wind that swept through Persepolis no longer carried hymns, only the hollow echo of what had once been called glory. The death of dignity came not with a sword, but with silence. It was the sound of a nation too afraid to speak truth to its own power. When Alexander's army crossed into Persia in 334 BCE, the empire that once ruled from Egypt to India was already hollow. What he conquered was not a civilization at its height, but a corpse adorned in gold. The palaces still stood. The royal tombs still glittered. Yet behind the marble walls lay the memory of centuries of cruelty, betrayal, and moral corrosion. Persia had devoured itself long before the Greeks arrived. The final Achaemenid king, Darius III, inherited a throne drenched in blood. He was no tyrant by nature, only the weary descendant of them. Surrounded by courtiers who lied for survival and generals who plotted behind his back, Darius ruled not through power, but through fear of collapse. His ancestors' sins had turned divine authority into a burden no mortal could bear. As Alexander advanced, Darius's own nobles betrayed him. Cities opened their gates to the Macedonians without resistance. The empire's soul had rotted from within, its people too accustomed to submission to fight for anything but themselves. When Darius fled, his closest ally, Bessus, captured him and then stabbed him to death in his sleep, leaving the king's body to rot in the dust. That betrayal marked the final act of Persia's self-destruction. Alexander would burn Persepolis to the ground, but it was the Persians who had already set fire to their spirit. The empire that had once built wonders of engineering, law, and art had reduced itself to a cycle of cruelty and deceit, an eternal court of ghosts feeding on its own corruption. When historians look back on Persia, they often speak of its grandeur, the palaces of Susa, the gardens of Pasargadae, the reliefs of Persepolis. Yet beneath the splendor lies another story, the cost of power built on fear. The empire's cruelty had become its foundation, its tradition, its identity. It consumed its priests, its nobles, its women, and finally its kings, until nothing remained but silence and dust. Alexander wept when he saw the ruins of Persepolis. Some said he mourned for what Persia had been, a civilization that could have rivaled the gods, if not for the cruelty that rotted it from within. And so the empire that devoured its soul left behind not a legacy of wisdom, but a warning. Power without conscience breeds decay. Fear disguised as reverence becomes death. And cruelty, once accepted as justice, becomes the heartbeat of destruction. Centuries later, the stones of Persepolis still stand beneath the sun, silent witnesses to an empire that once sought immortality. The carvings show kings offering gifts to the gods, their faces serene, their eyes eternal, yet beneath those perfect visages lies the truth of humanity's oldest curse, the hunger to rule, even at the cost of the soul. The Persian Empire did not fall to Alexander's sword. It fell to its own reflection.